Hello, and welcome to the Miss Mo Storyteller Podcast, where I tell you stories so you can tell stories to each other. I'm your storyteller, Mo Reynolds. Let's get started. Today's story comes from Germany, the land of the Grimm's brothers. The Brothers Grimm were story collectors, traveling throughout the land and recording old folk and fairy tales. Many a Disney movie has come from a Grimm's brother tale, just a much happier and less violent version. This is a lesser-known Grimm's tale, The King of the Golden Mountain. Once upon a time, there was a merchant. The merchant was wealthy, successful. He had 2 mighty ships and 1 son. Then one fateful day, the 2 ships were lost at sea. While he still had his 1 son, Heimel, the merchant had gone very suddenly from rich to poor. He did, however, still own a small plot of beautiful land. In the evenings, he would stroll about this land to clear his head and try to imagine a new future. On one such stroll, the merchant suddenly came upon a very small man in very odd clothes with a long, curling black beard. The merchant had sailed around the world without ever seeing such a man. "What troubles you?" asked the little man. Sighing, the merchant explained his troubles, his lost ships, his sudden poverty, his hungry son. With a wink, the man said, "I can help you. I will replace all that lost gold and more, but there is always a but when it comes to meeting strange people in the woods. But you must vow to meet me back in this spot in exactly 12 years, bringing the first thing that rubs against your leg when you arrive home today." The merchant, quite certain a dog or cat would be the thing to greet him when he drew closer to home, agreed. They shook hands, and the deal was set. Another week, and the little man vanished. These deals never seem to go the way one thinks they will. The merchant returned to his home, but wandered in the direction of the chicken coop, hoping to lure them out with feed and let them rub against his legs. Chickens don't even live 12 years. But someone else was waiting for him. His young and hungry son, Heimel, had been watching eagerly for his father to return. He spied his father from the porch and sprinted towards him. The boy came from behind. There was no time to stop him. He grabbed his father around the knees and laughed. The father fell forward, turned to see his red-cheeked son happy with his little trick. That happy little face turned to confusion when he saw his father's tears. The merchant was terrified. How could he turn his son over to that little man in just 12 years? Then he felt his son wipe the tears away, and the merchant laughed to himself. After all, there was no gold yet. Perhaps it had just been a dream. His son was safe. But the next morning, he went to the barn to milk the cows and discovered the buckets were already filled, just not with milk. Each bucket was overflowing with gold coins. It had not been a dream after all. The merchant counted the gold, and each coin brought more excitement to drown the fear. He had 12 years to sort it out right. He could solve this problem. He would invest, buy more ships, rebuild his wealth, and deal with the little man when the time came. For now, his son would no longer be hungry. The now well-fed Heimel grew, ignorant of his future, as his father's wealth expanded. The merchant pushed the looming meeting to the back of his mind, but it was always crawling forward, pressing on him harder and harder until, on the morning of the 12th anniversary, he could think of nothing else. Heimel walked into his father's bedroom and found him sobbing into the pillow. "Papa, what is wrong?" When his father explained the meeting in the woods, the bargain with the little man, that Heimel was the thing that had rubbed his leg, and that this was the day the little man expected payment, Heimel simply shrugged. He smiled. "Do not worry, Papa. I have a plan." And so he did. The merchant was unaware of how special his son truly was. He also would walk through the woods on their small plot of land, and in his journeys he had become friends with the fairies. These fairies had promised Heimel their luck and loyalty. They had prepared him against all kinds of dark magic. Heimel was ready. He took his father's hand, and they walked into the woods together. When they came to the place the father recognized, Heimel directed him to sit on the ground. Heimel sat next to his father and then drew a perfect circle around them both and smiled. Pop! The strange little man appeared before them, grinning an evil sort of grin. That grin faded when he saw the circle. Fairies, he thought. Fairies ruin everything. The little man was undone, but Heimel and his father had their own trouble. That perfect circle kept the little man out, but it also kept them in. They would need to strike a deal. The merchant wanted his son. The little man wanted payment. The merchant wanted wealth. The little man wanted to see suffering. What could be done? At last, Heimel and the little man struck a deal. Heimel would not go with either of them. He would be put in a boat and set out to sea to let nature handle it from there. The merchant would not lose his son to the wicked little man, and the wicked little man could be satisfied that the son would indeed be lost. Heimel was placed in the small boat and sent into the waves. The merchant knew the dangers of the sea and watched. The wicked little man watched as well, greedy to see suffering. The waves tossed Heimel, and not too long after launching, his small boat was flipped. Both men on the shore watched Heimel sink below the waves. The merchant fell to his knees and wept, while the little man skipped away. Had the merchant gotten off his knees and looked to the sea just one more time before hanging his head and heading home, he would have been met with a surprise. The good fairies were still with Heimel. They saved the boat from the waves, righted it, and sent Heimel on to a magical shore. There he found a castle, abandoned but lovely. He was certain there was enchantment surrounding it. He knew there was a reason the fairies had sent him to this shore. As he wandered through the dreary castle, he found something. In one of the enormous chambers, there was a silk cushion holding a brilliant white snake, coiled and asleep. Heimel thought immediately, this was likely no ordinary snake. It was definitely no ordinary snake. As Heimel drew nearer, the snake spoke to him in a lovely voice, explaining that she was a princess under a curse. The good fairies had promised her they would bring a hero to break the spell, and here he was. Heimel was more than happy to be a hero and break the curse. "What do I do?" he asked. "You must stay here in the castle," she said. "Tonight, a gang of 12 men will arrive. They will be dressed in armor, and they will beat you. You must let them without speaking a word." Heimel began to wonder if this princess was worth it. Oh, but she wasn't done yet. 12 more will come the second night and do the same, and then the third night, 24 will come. 24, and they will cut off your head. My head? Heimel was wondering about those fairies. Maybe they weren't as good as he thought. The snake couldn't really smile, but something in her eyes looked kind. "Don't worry. That will break the spell, and I will help you. I will bring the water of life and restore your head and health." It still sounded like a very long 3 days, but Heimel agreed. Everything happened just as the snake princess promised. Heimel was beaten. He was sore, stiff, and eventually quite headless. But then he awoke and locked eyes with the beautiful princess who had kept her word. She had revived him with the water of life and a very grateful kiss. Turns out she was not the only one under a spell. The entire castle and all its inhabitants had been cursed, and there was a celebration for Heimel and his courage. The celebration got even bigger when Heimel and the princess suddenly announced their engagement. There was a wedding, and Heimel became king of the Golden Mountain. Things happen very quickly in fairy tales. Years passed, and the king and queen of the Golden Mountain had children, adventures, and joy. After many years, however, Heimel began to miss his own father and longed to visit him with his wife and children. The queen worried. She had a bad feeling about this journey back to Heimel's home, but Heimel was persistent and she loved him. Finally, she agreed that he was free to go, but she would not go with him. She gave him a ring with a brilliant blue diamond and counseled him to use it to wish for whatever he needed. The ring could summon anything from anywhere to him or take him anywhere he wanted to be. But, she warned him, You must promise to never use it to summon me or our children." Heimel promised, grasped the ring, and wished to see his father. He opened his eyes and smelled home. But he did not look like little Heimel anymore, and he worried his father would not recognize or welcome him. So he went to the barn and found some old clothes, then returned to his father's door. You might think that the merchant would be thrilled to see Heimel, weep or dance for joy. But he wouldn't even let Heimel in the door. He didn't see his son or believe his story. "Prove it," he said, folding his arms across his chest. Heimel remembered the heart-shaped birthmark on his calf. He raised his pant leg and showed it to his father. Then came the weeping, and then came the dancing for joy. The merchant called for everyone to come see his son who had returned from the dead. They all wanted to hear the story of his survival. But they didn't want the real story. They couldn't believe it. Fairies, cursed snakes, a princess, an enchanted castle. It was too much. Heimel had wandered lost for so long he had quite simply gone mad. Heimel begged them to listen, to believe him. His father began to doubt that Heimel was even his son at all. In a mad desperation to convince him, Heimel grabbed the blue diamond and wished for his wife and children to appear. Suddenly there she was, a stunning queen and her royal children. The merchant and his friends were silenced, then broke into a joyful celebration. The queen, however, was not joyful at all. She glared at Heimel. "You broke your promise. No good will come of this." That night, after many apologies, the queen rewarded Heimel with a smile and told him to go to sleep. But as he slept, she slipped the diamond ring from his finger and wished herself and her children home to the Golden Mountain. When Heimel awoke and saw his young family gone, he wept. He knew he no longer belonged with his father, and without saying goodbye, he began his journey to find the Golden Mountain and his family once more. As you can imagine, it is no easy thing to find an enchanted castle on a golden mountain in the middle of a magical island, but he did his best. Luckily, the fairies were still his friends. They nudged him this way and that until he stumbled upon a set of giants. These were not fearsome, bloodthirsty giants, but they weren't the smartest giants either. They were standing in a circle, arguing about 3 objects piled up between them. As Heimel listened to the argument, it appeared they were trying to decide which of the 3 magical objects was best. One of them spotted Heimel and waved him over. "Sometimes these little men have big brains," he said. "Let's see what he thinks." Here is what the giants had. Number 1, a cloak that could either turn you invisible or turn you into anything you wanted. Number 2, a sword that would cut off your enemies' heads by simply holding it up and shouting, "Heads off!" And number 3, a pair of boots that could take you wherever you wanted with just a wish. Heimel could see the value in all 3. He also knew he had a use for each of them. "Well," he argued, "I can't really decide until I know they all work. I have to test them. Hand me the cloak." They gave him the cloak and he wished himself a fly, then back to Heimel again. "Okay, the cloak works. Now, the sword." The giants hesitated a little on that one. "Don't worry," Heimel assured them. "I'll just use it on the trees." And so he did. Raising the sword high over his head, Heimel stared at the forest and shouted, "Heads off!" And suddenly the top of 20 trees just fell to the ground. Heimel nodded and stuck the sword in his belt. "Finally, the boots," he said. As soon as he had the boots on his feet, he wished himself to the Golden Mountain, leaving the giants with their heads attached, but quite sure they would never ask a little man such as Heimel for help again. When Heimel returned to the Golden Mountain, there was a celebration happening. He wondered how they knew he was returning, but he was not the reason for the celebration. The queen was marrying again. Heimel was not happy. He covered himself with the cloak and disappeared. He found his wife and silently sat next to her at the dinner table. Every time food was placed on her plate, he stole it and ate it. He drank from her glass and emptied her plate over and over again, never saying a word. The queen wondered if she was cursed all over again and ran to her room in tears. He followed her and removed the cloak. He apologized once more and begged her to stay his wife. She agreed but warned him that there were traitors in the kingdom. He told her not to worry and carried the enchanted sword back to the banquet hall. His loyal followers were thrilled to see him, but the traitors that had arranged the queen's wedding, not so much. They charged the king, calling him a fraud, demanding his surrender. You probably know what Heimel did. With the sword over his head, he shouted, "Heads off!" And that was the end of the traitors. It was a very short revolution. Heimel was reunited with his forgiving queen and loving children. There was more love, more adventures. There were more challenges, but as best they could, they created a happily ever after. And what comes after the happily ever after? Well, that's up to you. What do you think happened next in the story? How would you change the story? What would you have done if you had been Heimel or the queen? Good stories often start by asking questions, so keep asking questions. Keep telling stories and keep listening to them. Thank you for listening today, and come back soon for another Once Upon a Time.